While the US Supreme Court's ruling on against President Trump, use of tariffs marks a clear setback for his use of trade levies as an economic weapon. Analysts say that it offers little immediate relief for the global economy. Instead, they expect another bout of activity crimping confusion combined with near certainty that Trump will seek other means to replace the raft of global tariffs now struck down as unlawful. In the meantime, a long list of uncertainties remain, including what new tariffs Trump will seek to impose, whether the funds from the annulled taxes will have to be refunded, and whether territories that enter deals with the US to mitigate their impact will see those paths reopened for review. Responding to the ruling, Trump announced that new global tariffs of 10% for an initial 150-day period and acknowledged that it was not clear if or when there would be any refunds. For those countries on higher US tariff levels, the change is more dramatic. For China, Brazil, and India, it will mean double-digit percentage point cuts.
All right, people, Jack here. So this is happening right now. The Supreme Court, in a 6-3 ruling, struck down the legal foundation of Trump's global tariff strategy, finding he overstepped his authority and that import duties must be set by Congress. The decision could trigger hundreds of billions in refunds and widespread litigation, representing a nuclear legal strike on a signature presidential policy. Let us be clear about what the ruling does and what it does not do. The court did not remove the president from office. It did not shut down the executive branch. It did not end the administration in any literal sense,
albeit to still high levels. Yet, no one expects this to remain the status quo. The Trump administration has served notice long before the ruling that it can and will use other legal vehicles to reimpose tariffs. UK, meanwhile, expects its privileged trading position with the United States to continue, the government said on the Friday of the baseline of 10% tariff it agreed with US.
What are Donald Trump's options at the moment? The Supreme Court has struck down on those tariffs. You have Secretary Scott Bessent, other administrative officials that are saying that they will invoke other legal justifications to retain as many Trump tariffs as possible. And if not, will these tariffs now cease to exist?
Well, there are two things which could happen. One is that, the US imposes similar tariffs under Section 301 for unfair trade practices by other countries. As I said, there has to be an investigation under that.
The president remains in office. He continues to exercise executive authority across every domain of the federal government. What the court destroyed is the legal foundation of his global tariff strategy. The specific case is Learning Resources Incorporated versus Trump. It struck down the president's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, commonly called IEEPA, to impose sweeping across-the-board tariffs on imports from essentially every country in the world simultaneously. The majority found that IEEPA does not authorize that kind of broad tariff imposition, that the president had exceeded his statutory authority.
Secondly, it can impose it on national security grounds under 232. So there are instruments which the US has under which it can impose tariffs on its trade partners, but they will not be so broad-based. They will be more limited. Or Trump can go to the Congress and say, you pass the legislation to impose these tariffs, because tariff imposition and financial powers are actually with the Congress, not with the president. So if the Congress passes legislation, then the tariffs become legal. So he has a range of options. How much he will bring them into play and in what manner, I think we have to wait and see.
First up, in a major setback for Donald Trump, the US Supreme Court has ruled that the president cannot impose sweeping global tariffs with a stroke of a pen. Breaking developments on your screens. In a 6-3 verdict, the court struck down Donald Trump's tariffs,
and that the constitutional power to levy taxes, including import duties, belongs to Congress, not to the president acting alone under emergency powers. This is a clean, clear, direct constitutional statement from the Chief Justice of the United States in a 6-3 decision. The consequences are going to ripple through the American economy and the American legal system for years. The case itself emerged from the real-world experience of American businesses. Learning Resources Incorporated is an educational toy and learning materials company that imports a significant portion of its products.
That formed the centerpiece of Trump's economic and foreign policy strategy. Chief Justice John Roberts, he wrote that the president had claimed extraordinary power, quote unquote, to unilaterally impose tariffs of unlimited scope, but failed to show clear authorization from the Congress party. Now, why does the ruling matter? The decision is the first major judicial pushback against Donald Trump's expansive view of presidential power on trade. An uphill battle for the president in the Congress as well. Donald Trump had counted on the tariffs to raise over $2 trillion for the federal budget over the next decade and to push manufacturing back to the United States. The administration had warned the court that striking down the tariffs could cause catastrophic consequences for the national security, for United States foreign policy, and for the country's economy. Now, just to look at what are Donald Trump's options.
When the global tariffs hit imports from essentially all of America's trading partners, companies like Learning Resources faced dramatically higher costs, paying duties on goods they were importing that under the old tariff regime would have faced much lower or no duties at all. Learning Resources and other affected importers challenged the tariffs in court. They argued that IEEPA, the emergency powers law the president was using as the legal basis for the tariffs, does not actually authorize the president to impose sweeping, broad-based import duties. The case worked its way through the federal courts and eventually reached the Supreme Court, and the court agreed with the importers. Chief Justice Roberts, writing for the 6-3 majority, said that the language of IEEPA does not support using it as a vehicle for broad tariff imposition. The law was designed for more targeted emergency economic interventions, specific sanctions, asset freezes, targeted trade restrictions in genuine emergency situations, not for sweeping reimposition of import duties that effectively restructure American trade policy wholesale. Most significantly, Roberts emphasized that the Constitution specifically gives Congress, not the President, the power to levy import duties. Using emergency powers to circumvent that constitutional allocation of authority is exactly the kind of executive overreach that the court's role is to correct. The author of the majority opinion is itself significant. Roberts is the Chief Justice. He is the institutional steward of the court. He is famously attentive to the court's institutional legitimacy and to the long-term consequences of its decisions. When Roberts writes an opinion, especially a significant one, it reflects a judgment not just about the specific legal question, but about where the court needs to draw lines to protect its own institutional role and to maintain the constitutional separation of powers. Roberts has written before about the importance of clear congressional authorization for major policy decisions, a doctrine sometimes called the major questions doctrine that says, when an agency or executive branch actor is claiming authority to make decisions of vast economic and political significance, that authority needs to be clearly authorized by Congress, not implied from ambiguous statutory language. The IEEPA tariff ruling fits squarely into that framework. Sweeping global tariffs affecting essentially all of America's trade relationships, generating potentially hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue, is exactly the kind of vast economic significance that the major questions doctrine says requires clear congressional authorization. Roberts found that IEEPA does not provide that clear authorization, which is why the tariffs had to go. The financial consequences of this ruling are staggering, and they are only beginning to be understood. Analysts estimate that the tariffs imposed under the struck-down IEEPA authority generated somewhere between $175 billion and $287 billion in revenue. That is an enormous range because the precise calculation depends on exactly which tariffs are covered by the ruling, over what time period, and what the applicable legal standards are for recovery. Even the low end of that range, $175 billion, represents a potential refund obligation of historic proportions. When importers paid duties under a tariff that the Supreme Court has now found was never legally authorized, they paid money they were not legally required to pay. Standard legal principles give them the right to recover those payments. The wave of litigation that will follow, importers filing refund claims, courts working through the applicable rules and limitations periods. The federal government trying to manage a process that has no real precedent at this scale is going to be one of the most significant legal and financial stories in the country for years. The federal government collected that tariff revenue and spent it. Getting it back to the importers who paid it creates a genuine fiscal complication at the same moment when the budget is already under strain from other factors. This is not an abstract legal consequence. It is a very concrete financial reality that is going to show up in court filings, budget discussions, and corporate earnings reports across the entire American business landscape. The ruling does not leave the president completely without trade policy leverage, but it significantly constrains his options and changes the dynamics of how he can use tariff power going forward. IEEPA was the most flexible and most powerful of the emergency trade tools because it had the fewest procedural requirements and the broadest potential scope. It allowed the president to impose tariffs quickly without going through the notice and comment process required under other statutes and without the same level of justification that other trade laws require. Stripping that tool away does not strip away all trade authority. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act allows tariffs based on national security findings. Section 301 of the Trade Act allows tariffs in response to specific unfair trade practices by specific countries. The general tariff rate system set by Congress remains in place, but all of those alternatives involve more process, more specific justification, more limitations on scope and duration. None of them allows the kind of sweeping across-the-board global tariff imposition that IEEPA was being used to support. And that limitation matters for how effectively the president can use tariff threats as negotiating leverage. Because the credible threat of quick sweeping global tariff escalation was a significant part of how his trade strategy worked. When trading partners know that the president's ability to impose those tariffs quickly is legally constrained, their calculation about how seriously to take tariff threats changes. And that change in calculation affects the negotiating dynamics around every trade relationship the United States has. The political fallout for the president is significant. Even though the ruling does not end his administration, it creates a political problem that is being processed in real time in Washington and in the broader media environment. The trade agenda has been one of the central pillars of his economic nationalism. The argument that he is protecting American workers and American industry from unfair foreign competition by using the power of the presidency to rewrite the terms of American trade. The Supreme Court ruling directly challenges the legal foundation of that agenda. It says the legal basis he was using was never valid, that the authority he claimed was not actually authorized by the statute he was invoking, that the money collected may have to be returned. Those are not talking points that any political team wants to be defending. The president's response, calling the decision ridiculous and insisting it does not really limit him, is itself revealing. It is the response of someone who knows the ruling is a significant blow and is trying to minimize its political impact by challenging its legitimacy. But calling a 6-3 Supreme Court decision ridiculous does not change its legal force. It does not stop the refund litigation. It does not restore the tariff authority that was struck down. And it does not address the fundamental constitutional point that Roberts made, that the power to levy import duties belongs to Congress, and that using emergency powers to circumvent that constitutional allocation requires clearer authorization than IEEPA provides. The broader political and economic context in which this ruling lands makes it even more consequential. The Supreme Court did not issue this opinion in a vacuum. It is landing in the middle of an economic environment that was already fragile. Inflation running above target, growth slowing, The Court of International Trade having already struck down the replacement tariff that the president announced after the IEEPA problems became apparent, and Republican senators publicly expressing concern about the economic cost of the tariff strategy. The IEEPA ruling adds another layer of legal and economic uncertainty to an environment that was already generating expert alarm about economic risks. It removes a major revenue source and potentially creates a massive refund liability at a moment when the federal budget is already stretched. It adds another round of legal chaos to an investment environment that was already being chilled by trade policy uncertainty. And it does all of this in a second term, where the president's approval ratings are sliding and where the economic promises that he made to voters who supported him are increasingly in tension with the economic reality of a tariff strategy that the courts keep finding was built on shaky legal foundations. The cumulative political weight of all of those intersecting pressures is significant, and this ruling adds meaningfully to that weight. The ruling's significance for the separation of powers and the constitutional architecture of American economic policy is the dimension of this decision that will matter most in the long run, more than any specific tariff refund or any specific political calculation. Roberts' majority opinion made a point that goes beyond IEEPA and beyond tariffs. It reaffirmed that when the executive branch claims authority to make decisions of vast economic and political significance, decisions that reshape major sectors of the American economy, that affect every trading relationship the country has, that generate hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue, that authority needs to be clearly and specifically granted by Congress. It cannot be implied from ambiguous emergency powers language. It cannot be stretched from statutory provisions designed for narrow emergency interventions to serve as vehicles for wholesale restructuring of economic policy. That principle, that major questions require major congressional authorization, is one of the most important constitutional doctrines of the current era. It has been applied in contexts ranging from environmental regulation to public health authority. Its application here in the trade context is a significant expansion of its reach that will affect how future presidents of both parties can use executive power to shape economic policy. The constitutional vision that emerges from this ruling is one of clear boundaries between executive and legislative authority. The president has broad power in the security and political domains, but when it comes to taxation and economic policy, the constitutional allocation of power to Congress means something. It means that presidents cannot use emergency statutes to take over functions that the Constitution specifically reserves to the legislative branch. This is an important and consequential institutional message. It will shape the exercise of presidential economic power for decades to come. The dimension of this ruling that is most underappreciated in the initial coverage is that it is not just about tariffs, and it is not just about the current president. It is about the major questions doctrine applied to the economic domain in a way that will have lasting implications for how every future president, Democratic or Republican, can use executive power to shape economic policy. The Roberts Court has been developing and applying the major questions doctrine for years, using it to strike down previous administration initiatives on student loan forgiveness and vaccine mandates, among other things. Those applications established that in the domestic regulatory domain, major policy decisions require clear congressional authorization. The IEEPA ruling extends that principle to the international trade domain. It says that sweeping changes to American trade policy, changes of the magnitude that reshape the tariff regime for essentially all of America's trading relationships simultaneously, also require clear congressional authorization. That is a significant and durable constraint not just on the current president but on any future president who wants to use emergency powers to make major trade policy changes quickly without going through Congress. Future presidents who want to use trade tools aggressively are now on notice that the Supreme Court will scrutinize whether their statutory authority clearly covers what they are doing. And that notice changes the calculus for every future trade policy initiative that claims to rest on emergency or executive authority rather than explicit congressional authorization. The practical implications of the decision for the relationship between Congress and the presidency on economic policy are profound. One of the most significant practical implications is that it redirects the trade policy conversation toward Congress in ways that the IEEPA regime had effectively avoided. When the president can impose sweeping tariffs through emergency powers without congressional authorization, Congress is largely cut out of the trade policy conversation. Its members can express opinions, they can hold hearings, they can write letters, but the president can act without them. The IEEPA ruling changes that dynamic. If the most powerful tariff tool has been struck down, and the alternatives require more specific justification and more process, the president who wants a durable, legally sound, broad tariff strategy has to go to Congress to get explicit authorization. That means negotiating with legislators who have their own constituents, their own economic interests, and their own views on trade policy. It means the kind of messy, slow, compromise-driven legislative process that executive action was precisely designed to avoid. And it means that the president, if he wants a broad tariff strategy that is legally bulletproof, has to work with a Congress that has been expressing its own concerns about the economic cost of the tariff approach. That legislative dynamic is going to be one of the most consequential political stories of the second term going forward, and the Supreme Court ruling is what forced it onto the agenda. The refund exposure is the most immediately concrete consequence, and it is enormous. $175 billion to $287 billion in potentially refundable tariff revenue is not a number that fits comfortably in any normal budget discussion. It represents a fiscal complication of historic proportions at a moment when the federal government is already managing significant budget pressures. The litigation wave that will follow the ruling, importers filing refund claims, courts working through the applicable rules, the government trying to manage a process that has no real precedent, will consume enormous resources and generate enormous uncertainty for years. Individual businesses that paid significant duties under the struck-down tariffs are already calculating their refund claims. Trade lawyers across the country are working through the legal mechanics of recovery, and the federal government's lawyers are trying to figure out how to manage a refund obligation that may dwarf anything the federal court system has previously been asked to process in a trade context. The financial consequences of this ruling are going to be felt in concrete, practical ways that go far beyond any abstract legal principle. The president's remaining trade tools are significantly more constrained, and that matters for his negotiating leverage. Losing IEEPA as a tariff vehicle does not leave him without any trade authority, but it does significantly constrain the speed, scope, and credibility of tariff threats that were central to his negotiating strategy. The alternative statutes, Section 232, Section 301, the general tariff rate system, all involve more process, more specific justification, and more limitations on scope. They cannot be used to impose sweeping global tariffs quickly in response to a negotiating dispute. And that means the credible threat of fast, broad, escalating tariff pressure, which was one of the president's primary trade negotiating tools, is no longer available in the form it was being used. Trading partners who are recalculating their negotiating positions in light of the ruling are doing so based on a realistic assessment that the tariff threat they were facing is now legally constrained in ways it was not before. That recalculation changes the dynamics of every ongoing trade negotiation that was being conducted against the backdrop of potential IEEPA tariff escalation. The ruling signals that even this court has limits on executive power, and that is a constitutionally important message. The immunity ruling was a significant expansion of presidential protection from criminal prosecution. It was a 6-3 decision that gave presidents broad shelter from criminal liability for official acts. The IEEPA tariff ruling is also 6-3, but in the opposite direction on executive power in the economic domain. Together, the two rulings give you a picture of where this court draws lines. It expanded presidential immunity from criminal prosecution because it concluded that the threat of criminal prosecution could improperly constrain presidents in the exercise of their official functions. But it struck down the use of emergency economic powers for broad tariff imposition because it concluded that the constitutional allocation of taxing and tariff authority to Congress cannot be circumvented by stretching emergency powers beyond their authorized scope. Those two principles are not contradictory. They reflect a coherent constitutional vision of presidential authority, strong and protected in the core political and security domains of the presidency, but constrained by the constitutional allocation of specific powers like taxation to the legislative branch. Understanding that vision helps you understand how future cases involving the president's agenda are likely to be decided. And it tells you that while this court is not hostile to broad presidential power across the board, it is willing to draw hard lines when presidents try to use emergency statutes to take over functions that the Constitution specifically reserves to Congress. The founding generation that designed the American constitutional system was deeply worried about concentrated economic power. They specifically put the taxing power, including import duties, in the hands of Congress precisely because they understood that the power to tax is the power to destroy, and that such power needed to be subject to the democratic accountability that the legislative process provides. When presidents use emergency powers to bypass that design, to impose sweeping taxes on imports without the legislative process that the Constitution envisions, they are doing something the framers specifically tried to prevent. Roberts's majority opinion channels that founding concern directly. It says in effect that the constitutional structure was not an accident, that putting the tariff power in Congress was a deliberate choice that reflects a deliberate understanding of how economic power needs to be constrained and made accountable in a democracy, and that emergency statutes designed for specific limited interventions cannot be stretched to circumvent that constitutional design without exceeding the authority those statutes provide. That is a constitutional principle that matters not just for this administration in this moment. It matters for the long-term health of the American constitutional system. And the court's willingness to enforce it against a president who argued strenuously for a more expansive view of his emergency authority is the most important institutional message that comes out of this ruling. The broader economic implications of the ruling extend beyond the refund question. The uncertainty created by the legal status of the tariff strategy has been a significant factor in business investment decisions. Companies that were holding back on investment because they did not know what the tariff regime would look like 6 months from now have a different kind of uncertainty to navigate. The legal foundation has been struck down, but the administration may try to rebuild on different statutory grounds. The litigation will take years to resolve. The refund exposure will hang over budget planning. The overall effect is that the trade policy uncertainty that has been a drag on investment is not resolved by the ruling. It is transformed into a different kind of uncertainty. That transformation has its own economic consequences that will show up in growth projections and business confidence measures in the months ahead. The international implications of the ruling are also significant. American trading partners have been watching the litigation closely. Many of them have been holding back on their own trade policy responses pending the outcome of the court case. Now that the ruling has come down, they have to recalibrate their own strategies. Some may see the ruling as an opportunity to press for more favorable terms. Others may be concerned about what the administration will do next to compensate for the loss of IEEPA authority. The overall effect on international trade relations is one of added complexity and uncertainty at a moment when the global trading system is already under significant strain. The ruling also has implications for the broader debate about executive power in the American constitutional system. The major questions doctrine has been one of the most consequential developments in constitutional law in recent years. It has been applied to strike down major regulatory initiatives on environmental policy, public health, and now trade. The doctrine is not without its critics. Some argue that it represents a judicial power grab that is constraining legitimate executive authority. Others argue that it is a necessary check on executive overreach in a system designed to diffuse power across multiple branches. Whatever one thinks of the doctrine, its application in the trade context is a significant development that will be studied and debated for years. The specific facts of the learning resources case are important to understanding why the court ruled as it did. The company imports educational toys and learning materials. The tariffs imposed under IEEPA significantly increased its costs. It challenged the tariffs not on policy grounds, but on statutory and constitutional grounds. The company argued that IEEPA did not authorize what the president was doing. And the court agreed. This is not a ruling about whether tariffs are good or bad policy. It is a ruling about whether the president had legal authority to impose them in the way he did. The court found that he did not. That finding has enormous consequences regardless of one's views on the substantive policy question. The timing of the ruling is also significant. It comes at a moment when the administration is facing multiple legal and political challenges simultaneously: the impeachment conversations, the 25th Amendment discussions, the criminal cases, the economic pressures, the international conflicts. Adding a major trade policy defeat to that mix creates an environment of sustained, compounding pressure on the administration that makes it harder to manage any single challenge because each is compounded by the others. The ruling will be analyzed, debated, and litigated for years. Its full implications will not be known for some time. But what is clear already is that it represents one of the most significant judicial interventions in presidential economic policy in modern American history. And its consequences will be felt across the economy, across the political system, and across the constitutional order for years to come.